Hello guys, it's Ross Hoddinott from Nature TTL, and today I'm going to show you how to take sharper landscape photographs. As a landscape photographer, I want my images to be sharp front to back, and there's a variety of ways that we can employ to ensure that our images are really pin sharp. And today I want to show you those things and help you to achieve bitingly sharp images consistently. And I'm going to start with a very basic tip, and that is to always use a tripod. They're great for stability and actually helping you to frame your shot, but fundamentally they're there for stability, and I would rarely take a landscape image without using my tripod. This one's a Gitso. It's carbon fibre, which means it's a little bit lighter, which is useful for when you're walking long distances. But it doesn't really matter which brand you decide to go for. The most important thing is that it's stable, it's strong, and it's going to ensure that your camera is fixed in position and you can take images in windy weather and shoot long exposures without any risk of your images being blurred. Tip number 2 is to make sure that your image stabilizer is switched off. When you're shooting handheld, it makes complete sense to have it turned on because it's going to help you to take sharp images. But as soon as you use a tripod, your image stabilizer can actually create a little bit of motion through the way it works, and also you're just using battery life, so just make sure it's switched off. So tip number 3 regards aperture selection. So if you're not already aware of how apertures work, small aperture, which is a large number, generates a large depth of field. But a large aperture, which is represented by a small number like f2.8, achieves a very shallow depth of field. Now, landscape photographers typically want everything from their foreground to the background to be acceptably sharp. So we normally prioritise using smaller apertures. But the big question is, what is the perfect aperture for a landscape image like this one? For my landscape images, I favour a mid-range aperture of around f11. But why is that when you consider that a very small aperture like f22 will generate the biggest depth of field? Well, there's a good reason why we should try and avoid those extremes. There's an effect called diffraction, which when you shoot at say f16, f22, actually causes the image to grow softer, and it's all to do with the way that a lens will scatter light as light passes through the aperture. A larger percentage of light gets diffracted, and although you're generating a larger depth of field at f22, you're effectively making the overall image softer. So when I make my selection, I try and avoid the extremes, and I go for a mid-range aperture, which kind of gives me the best of both worlds. I'm achieving sufficient depth of field, but I'm still hopefully hitting my lens's sweet spot. We have selected an aperture of f11 to give us a large depth of field. But the big question is now, where do we focus within the landscape? And your point of focus is a really important consideration. Depth of field in a wide angle shot roughly falls 2/3 beyond the point of focus and 1/3 in front of it. So if you focus too far into the scene, you're going to waste that depth of field. Equally, if you focus too close to you, you're going to waste the depth of field in front of your point of focus. Therefore, if you focus roughly a third way into the shot, you're going to maximise your depth of field to some degree. And so where you focus really is a very important consideration. But this third way in approach, which a lot of photographers adopt, isn't particularly precise. And so we're going to look at some other ways which hopefully will maximise your sharpness when you shoot a scene like this. The first of these is something called hyperfocal focusing, which sounds very complicated, but actually is simplified today through various charts and apps. Basically, what the hyperfocal distance is, it's a certain point that will maximise depth of field for any given focal length or aperture combination. So for example, if you're shooting at 20mm with an aperture of f11, there will be a distance which theoretically will maximise your depth of field. Today, all we have to do is apply these things to an app, or just look at a chart, and then your job is, once you've found that distance, is to focus on it, and theoretically you will maximise depth of field from front to back. However, over the past couple of years, I've been using hyperfocal focusing far less, and that's because I think the formula is slightly outdated and it's sacrificing too much background information. So in other words, the formula is making me focus a little bit too close into the scene. So the foreground is nice and sharp, but the background is getting softer and softer. And I think a lot of that is down to the fact that today our cameras are so high resolution, our demands are much greater, we enlarge our images to a much greater extent, and that old formula isn't able to support that. And instead today I tend to do something called double distance focusing. So what exactly is double distance focusing? Well, the good news is it's much simpler than the hyperfocal distance. All you're doing is looking for the closest point within your scene that you want to be sharp, and then you're doubling that distance and focusing at that point. So, for example, this scene here, I want these ledges in the foreground to be nice and sharp, and my closest point that I want to be in focus is approximately 2.5 meters away. So in this instance, I'm going to focus around 5 meters away, and that should theoretically ensure that everything from my foreground right through to my background is nice and sharp. So what do you do in the rare instances where you can't achieve sufficient depth of field through your focusing and aperture choice? Well, you could use a tilt and shift lens, but that tends to be quite a specialised and expensive piece of kit, and so very few photographers tend to have those with them. Alternatively, you can do something called focus stacking, which involves you taking a number of shots but focusing at different points within the scene and then merging those together in post-processing to generate depth of field from front to back. I'm finally ready to take my photograph, but there's still a couple of things that I can do to ensure that my image is bitingly sharp. The first thing is to ensure that when I actually take the photograph, I don't introduce any kind of movement by physically pressing the camera. What I'm going to do in this instance is I'm going to use a cable release. I'm going to attach this so that I can release the shutter remotely, but if you don't have one of these, you could just put your camera onto a self timer, just a couple of second delay, and that should achieve exactly the same result. Just going to pop this in. I'm also going to make sure that I take the photograph with live view activated, and the reason for this is during live view the camera's mirror is locked up, and that ensures that there's no mirror slap when I actually take the photograph. If you don't activate live view, then it's worth activating your mirror lockup facility, which most cameras have, and obviously if you're using a mirrorless camera, it's something you don't need to worry about. And now finally, I'm ready to take my photograph. Hopefully my image is absolutely pin sharp, having gone through all the focusing techniques that we've just discussed. But you shouldn't just take it for granted. There's lots of things that can cause softness, like wind movement, or if you're on the beach, it can be that the kind of tide lapping in can mean the tripod sinks into the sand. So it's always a good idea to review your images afterwards. So I'm just going to press the replay button. And I'm not just going to take that on face value, because images always tend to look sharp when they pop up on your screen. I'm going to again magnify the shot. I'm going to zoom into the background and make sure that's looking sharp. And look at my foreground and make sure that's looking sharp. And just to kind of really make sure that everything is completely pin, I tend to use a viewing loop. Just put this over the screen, adjust the diopter to my eyes, and then just scroll around. And now I can feel very confident that image is absolutely pin sharp, front to back, and I have a beautifully sharp landscape image. There you have it, guys. I hope you've really enjoyed my top tips to capturing sharper landscape images. If you've got any tips or comments of your own, please feel free to leave them below. And don't forget to subscribe to Nature TTL's YouTube channel for weekly tutorials, features and kit reviews.